This is V for Verdict, and today we talk about the case of Republic versus Ruth Wanjiku Kamande. Now, acts of violence between intimate partners form a huge bulk of the cases that we handle in the criminal section of our courts. These are actions that also fall under gender-based violence. Now, the facts of this case were that the accused, Ruth Kamande, was charged with murder contrary to Section 203 of the Penal Code, as read with Section 204 of the Penal Code. Now, the particulars of the offense are that on the 20th day of September 2015 at Buruburu Estate within Nairobi County, Ruth Kamande murdered FARID, MOHAMED, HALIM. Now, the prosecution in this case called a total of 15 witnesses. The background is that the accused person was having a relationship with the deceased person, Mr. Mohammed, and at the time of the incident, they were living together. It is not clear from the evidence how long they had lived together. It is, however, clear that on the week leading to the fateful morning, the two had been together. On that Sunday morning of 20th September 2015, at 9 a.m. or thereabouts, screams and calls for help were heard in the house of the deceased person, Mr. Mohammed, a house that he had rented from a couple, which was the landlord and the landlady, and they were man and wife respectively. Now, the landlord's wife was the first to go to the back of her house where the accused was to find out what the matter was. As she walked towards the house, she heard Mohammed saying, "Nisaidie, nisaidie, amenidunga," which is to mean, help me, she has stabbed me. The landlord's wife knocked on the door and asked loudly what was going on inside the house. Then she heard Mohammed say, "It is this one who has stabbed me," followed immediately by the words, "I have been stabbed again." At that point, her husband arrived at the scene from their house. The house where the deceased was calling from, his rented premises, was locked, and the landlord left to open the front door to their house. Now, the landlord was left to try and rescue Mohammed. He testified that he looked inside the house and saw Mohammed standing facing a woman who had her back on him. This is now the landlord. The landlord came to know the woman as the accused in this case. Mohammed was holding his abdomen and appeared to be in great pain. On the other hand, the accused person, Ruth, was blocking Mohammed from entering the kitchen. Now, the landlord asked Mohammed for his house keys, to which he told him to access it near the kitchen window. The landlord then decided to break the window panel as the window was closed. He said that Mohammed was still holding his stomach and lower abdomen when he broke the kitchen window. Mohammed was standing on the small corridor between the kitchen and the sitting room. Ruth Kamande was holding a knife in her hand, lifted, actively blocking Mohammed from accessing the kitchen. Now, the landlord stated that he could not get the keys even after breaking the window pane. He said that in desperation, he asked Mohammed why he could not punch the accused on her breasts and overpower her like a man. Mohammed could hardly release his hands from holding his abdomen. The landlord's husband said that he saw a neighbor outside and that he sent him to call police at the police station that was nearby, which was the Buruburu police station, which was about 1 kilometer away. Just then, the landlord returned and heard the deceased, which was Mohammed, crying out that he had been stabbed again. He then heard Mohammed screaming from inside his bedroom. He peeped through the bedroom window and saw Ruth Kamande in the bedroom, still holding a knife. Mohammed was kneeling beside the bed with his body leaning on the bed. Now, at this point, another neighbor joined the landlord. Police also came soon thereafter. By then, Mohammed had gone quiet. They were to discover that he had already died. Now, the neighbor saw the accused person, Ruth, climb the kitchen sink and reach out for keys. The court noted that there was some inconsistency in the evidence of the prosecution. According to the neighbor, Kamande handed over the keys to the landlord. However, the landlord says that it was a police officer who ordered the accused to open the door, to which she did. The court, however, was of the view that the matter was not in dispute, as Ruth Kamande in her defense stated that she was ordered to open the house by an officer who had a gun, which she did. Now, a postmortem was carried out on the body of Mohamed at the city mortuary the same day by Dr. Oduro Johansen. The doctor formed the opinion that the deceased died of multiple injuries and blood loss due to penetrating force trauma. The doctor found a total of 25 stab wounds on the chest, hands, legs, head, abdomen, back, and shoulders of the deceased, with intestines sticking out of the abdomen. The body was pale, proof of loss of excessive blood. Now, the prosecution also produced a P3 form on the examination of the accused. Dr. Maundu, who had examined the accused, stated that she had a cut on the chest wall, several cuts on abdomen and on the left hand and right leg. They classified the injuries on the accused as harm. They also found the accused fit to stand trial. They stated that the accused person did not complain of any sexual assault. If you're still moving with me here, remember the accused person is Ruth Kamande, so when that term is used, it's used interchangeably. Another doctor, Dr. Muya, was called. He testified that he treated Ruth Kamande at Kenyatta National Hospital. He said that Ruth complained of assault with a sharp object and also of sexual assault. He examined her and found multiple soft tissue injuries in the chest and abdomen. On pelvic examination, her genitalia was found to be normal. An abdominal ultrasound scan revealed no injuries to the abdomen, and an X-ray of the chest revealed no injuries or fractures. Now, the initial investigating officer in the case testified that he entered the house of the deceased Mohamed the same day of the incident. He stated that he recovered love cards in the deceased's bedroom, which he produced as exhibits. He also recovered keys and 2 padlocks. He recovered a blood-stained top and shorts from the accused Ruth Kamande, which he produced as Exhibit 9. And another witness stated as well that he took mouth swabs from the accused person. Now, this witness stated that one of the officers to arrive first at the scene handed over to him a knife. The knife was identified by the landlord as the one that the accused used to stab Mohamed, the deceased person. The witness stated that when he saw the accused the same day of the incident, she was able to walk without aid and appeared composed and calm. Now, in her defense, Ruth Kamande gave an unsworn statement. Her defense was that Mohamed attacked her because she saw an AIDS report on him and threatened to expose him to his family. She said that she saw the report in the bed that fateful morning. She also stated that Mohamed turned violent against her and that he threw her on the bed, sat on her, and with a knife he was carrying, stabbed her several times on the chest, hands, thighs, and stomach. She stated that she was able to disarm him after pressing his eyes and took the knife from him. Ruth stated that while lying on the bed and with Mohamed seated on her, she stabbed him several times, and she said she lost count of how many times she stabbed him. She told the court that the day before the incident, the two of them had a quarrel over love letters she saw in a drawer in the bedroom. She said that she had wanted to know from Mohamed why he was still keeping the love letters from his previous lover many years later. She said that at the time, Mohamed's uncle had visited. She said that they were able to resolve the issue and they spent the night peacefully. Now, in her court submissions, Ruth stated that the prosecution had failed to prove malice aforethought, urging that the number of injuries that she had inflicted on Mohamed were not sufficient to prove the same. They also argued that the actual damage caused to the internal organs by the stab wounds could not be ascertained because the deceased was not opened up. Now, for purposes of murder has certain elements that must be proven. The first one is malice aforethought, or what we call the mens rea. That's a guilty mind. You have to actually prove that the person had the intention to cause injury or to cause death, as they did. And then the second thing is you have to prove that it is their actions that led to the death of the individual. All right? So in terms of the accused case, they argued that she also suffered multiple injuries on her chest and abdomen, which necessitated her admission at Kenyatta Hospital. They urged the court to find that both her and the deceased person suffered severe injuries. With regards to the witnesses, they argued that the evidence that had been provided was not sufficient to prove that Ruth hid the keys to the house, as had been argued by the prosecution. Her lawyer stated that the hidden keys claim did not support premeditation. Now, in regards to the police evidence that Ruth was able to walk on her own, Ruth's lawyer asked the court to find that he also saw the accused confused and not calm. She also discounted the evidence of the sister and the cousin to Mohammed that Ruth was jealous and possessive of the deceased. They argued that the sister contradicted the cousin, that the accused was not a girlfriend of Mohammed, arguing that the cousin denied that in her evidence. Now, on the part of the state, the prosecution counsel urged the court to find that the prosecution had proved its case beyond any reasonable doubt, which is a standard in criminal prosecutions. She urged the court to find that Ruth Kamande inflicted multiple injuries on Mohammed with the sole intention of causing his death. She also urged the court to consider the evidence that had been brought to court by the landlord and his wife, among the first at the scene of the murder, who stated that Ruth stabbed Mohammed at intervals. The prosecution urged the court to find that the two witnesses had the deceased screaming and saying that he had been stabbed again and again several times was proof that the accused person, Ruth, did not stab the deceased in one go, as she claimed in her defense. The prosecution further argued that since the accused and the deceased were alone in the house, it had to be the accused, Ruth, who stabbed and seriously injured Mohammed, causing his death. It was also the prosecution case that Ruth was obsessed with Mohammed. She was extremely jealous and possessive to the extent she did not want to see any woman near him. The prosecution urged the court to find that when Ruth discovered love letters from previous friends of Mohammed, this angered her and that it was a motive for the attack on Mohammed. The court was now invited to make a finding based on the evidence that had been presented before them. Of course, the first thing the court has to do is to begin with the law. And Section 203 of the Penal Code states that any person who, of malice aforethought, causes the death of another person by unlawful act or omission is guilty of murder. The court rightly held that the prosecution must establish malice aforethought to bring the actions of the accused on the material day within the offence of murder. Now, the Criminal Procedure Code of Kenya at Section 206 sets out some of the circumstances that would constitute malice aforethought as follows. This is what the law says. Malice aforethought shall be deemed to be established by evidence proving any one or more of the following circumstances. Number one, that there was an intention to cause the death of or to do grievous harm to any person, whether that person is a person actually killed or not. So intention is number one. Number two, you must show knowledge that the act or omission causing death will probably cause the death of or grievous harm to some person, whether that person is a person actually killed or not, although such knowledge is accompanied by indifference, whether death or grievous bodily harm is caused or not, by a wish that it may not be caused. All right? So here, the action that was being taken, you have to have known that the outcome of that would have been death or grievous harm. The next thing as well is that you have to show that there was an intent to commit a felony. And finally, an intention by the act or omission to facilitate the flight or escape from custody of any person who has committed or attempted to commit a felony. In the court's mind, the issues in the case were very clear. First, there are facts that are not in dispute. The court found that it was not disputed that Mohammed and Ruth Kamande were living together for an unknown period of time when the incident occurred. Indeed, the witnesses had testified that they had seen the accused in the deceased house for 2 months before the incident. This was the evidence of Mohammed's maternal uncle, that he had actually seen Kamande in Mohammed's house 2 months before the incident. He also stated that he was a constant visitor to Mohammed, who was his sister's son, because his home was not far from Mohammed's home. Now, it is also not in dispute that for 2 days before the incident, Mohammed and Ruth had a tense relationship. Indeed, when the court looked at the evidence of Mohammed's sister, who had a conversation with him on WhatsApp 2 days before the incident, those messages indicated that Mohamed was not happy with Ruth. The messages showed that Mohamed shared an incident the day before, which was the 17th of September, where Ruth blocked his SIM card as she tried to enter a password and PIN in order to read his messages. He had stated on WhatsApp to his sister that since Ruth had discovered that he knew that she usually checked his phone, he had just changed his password and PIN. Mohamed continued to complain in those messages that Ruth had even beaten him in the night. He also complained that she had locked herself in the bedroom as she tried to access his messages on the phone and did not open the bedroom door for him for half an hour, even though she knew that he was getting late for work. Now, going by those retrieved messages in court, Mohamed had told his sister that after the drama where Ruth was crying over frustration for not accessing his messages, and thereafter the drama of following him as he went to work, he had told her that he was calling off their relationship as he did not want such drama in his life. Now, for Mohamed's sister in her evidence, she stated that from all information from Mohamed and from her previous encounter with Ruth, where Ruth scanned her from head to toe, was aggressive to her for finding her having a meal with Mohamed, she had concluded that Ruth was jealous and envious of Mohamed and aggressive and unfriendly to any woman getting close to Mohamed. Now, the sister to the deceased also testified that the deceased sounded uneasy and bored the night before he was murdered. The cousin testified that even though it was Mohamed who called her that evening, he was not responding to her questions. He, however, told her that he was with Biggie, which was a nickname for Ruth Kamande. She stated that she realized there was something wrong and decided to let the matter rest. Now, Mohamed's maternal uncle, who had visited him and found him with Ruth the night before the attack, also shed some further light in the matter. He testified that he had asked Mohamed why Ruth had locked herself in the bedroom when he had visited them and why she was cold towards him. He said that Mohamed told him that Ruth had discovered old love letters written to him and she was angry and upset over them and could not understand why he was still keeping them. He testified that Mohamed informed him that he was going straight to sleep because he did not want to argue with Ruth. Now, the court found that it was clear that Ruth and Mohamed had tension on the night before the incident and that the tension was over love letters Mohamed had kept from his past relationships. It was also clear from the evidence that 2 days before the incident, Ruth in this case was upset with Mohamed for changing his phone PIN number and password, making it difficult for her to access his phone messages. She even took his SIM card and tried it on her phone in an attempt to access the phone content. There was also evidence that Ruth was crying and following Mohamed that morning of 18th September, leading Mohamed to warn her that he was going to call off their relationship. The court also found that in her unsworn evidence, Ruth admitted the issue of the changed PIN to the deceased phone. She also admitted her unusual behavior of locking herself up in the bedroom when the uncle to Mohamed visited. She, however, explained that she had painful periods and that it was the reason she left them in the sitting room. The court also found that there was further evidence that Mohamed was unhappy and restless, arising from a call he made to his sister the night after his uncle left his house. He was unusually quiet and did not respond to the questions. He only indicated to his sister that he was with Ruth. Now, Ruth admitted to stabbing Mohamed and stated that she did it several times but could not tell the actual number. She put forward a defense of self-defense. She said that she was under attack and the accused armed himself with a knife and sat on her to stab her. And the deceased armed himself with a knife and sat on her to stab her. Now, the court rightly finds that the burden lied with the prosecution to prove the case against Ruth beyond any reasonable doubt. The prosecution must prove that at the time the accused stabbed the deceased, she was motivated by malice and that she was not acting in self-defense as she has pleaded in her defense. Now, the court began by looking at some of the decisions that have been issued in Kenya on whether an intention to commit murder is proven. Number one is that malice aforethought, which talks about the intention to kill, or implied where by a voluntary act by a person intending to cause grievous bodily harm to his victim, and the victim has died as a result of that. Now, before an act can be murder, it must be aimed at someone and must be an act committed with one of the following intentions. Number one, there has to be an intention to cause death. Number two, an intention to cause grievous bodily harm. And number three, where the accused person knows that there's a serious risk that death or grievous bodily harm will ensure from his acts, and yet they proceed to commit this act deliberately. Now, without an intention of one of these three types, the mere fact that the accused's conduct is done in the knowledge that grievous harm is likely or highly likely to ensue from their conduct is not by itself enough to convert a homicide into the crime of murder. Now, by citing this case, the court was holding that even though the conduct was done with the knowledge that the action is likely or highly likely to cause death or grievous harm, that in itself is not enough if there is no evidence to establish that the accused, in this case Ruth, had formed an intention to cause death or to cause grievous harm, or knew her conduct may cause serious harm or death, but committed the act deliberately anyway. Now, in that case that the court was referring to, the accused person had stabbed the deceased only once. So bringing that to this case, the court began by finding that there was no one else in the house when the incident started. The first person to arrive at the scene, who was the landlord's wife, found Mohamed and Ruth in the small space outside the kitchen, but before the sitting room of Mohamed's house. According to her, by the time she reached outside the house, Mohamed had been stabbed several times. This is established going by the words that she had spoken by him, stating, "Nimedungwa tena." And these words the court took to mean, "I have been stabbed again." Now, she stated that Ruth continued to stab Mohamed intermittently just next to the kitchen. According to the landlord and his wife, by the time Mohamed moved to the bedroom, by the time the landlord moved to the bedroom, the deceased person, Mohamed, could no longer cry out for help. The court found that the evidence of the landlord and landlady clearly established that Ruth and Mohamed were not in the bedroom when the attack started. Her defense was that Mohamed was sitting on her in the bedroom when he attacked her, and that all the stabs she inflicted on him was from a lying down position with Mohamed on top, therefore could not be true. It was clear that Mohamed was not in the bedroom when he was first stabbed. Now, the evidence that had been brought as well in court clearly stated the areas where Mohamed was stabbed. He had multiple stab wounds, 9 on the chest, several others on the abdomen, rib cage, backside, shoulder, back of head, and on the legs, on both the front and the back. He was stabbed 25 times in total. The court found it is not logical that at the time Ruth stabbed Mohamed on all those parts of the body, she was in a lying position with the deceased in a seated position above her. The evidence of the people who entered the house was that there was blood on the walls and the floor of the house and also on the bed. Unfortunately, in this case, the photographs of the scene were destroyed by mistake or by error. Nonetheless, the court found that the evidence of these witnesses established that the whole house had blood everywhere, evidence which discounted Ruth's defense that the incident only occurred in the bedroom. There was also an eyewitness account of the landlord and his wife who clearly saw Mohamed in the small veranda between the kitchen and the sitting room. The court was of the view that the evidence of the eyewitness account discredited the defense of the accused person that the attack was confined to the bedroom. In the court's mind, the evidence was clear that the deceased was on his feet in the kitchen and corridor when the accused attacked him. In addition, further evidence that Ruth climbed the sink to reach for the key to the house after Mohamed had already succumbed to the injuries, taken together with the evidence of the landlord and his wife that Ruth blocked Mohamed from reaching the kitchen to get the keys where he normally kept them in order to escape from her, And the fact that Ruth not only stabbed Mohammed 25 times all over the body, but did it intermittently, all taken together established beyond doubt that Ruth Kamande had formed the intention to cause grievous harm or death to Mohammed. Ruth Kamande inflicted each stab not in a frenzy as she had alleged in her defense, but deliberately and intermittently. Her action was calculated to inflict pain and cause death slowly but assuredly. In the court's mind, that was clear proof of malice, of spite, callousness, and hatred. The judge said, "There is no doubt in my mind that the accused action was caused by malice." The second question was whether the action was provoked. Now, the court stated that the prosecution had gone further to show the events that had taken place between the accused and the deceased person 2 days prior to the incident up to the night before. Those events showed that Ruth Kamande was extremely jealous of Mohammed and held a grudge against him for having kept some cards sent to him while in school 6 years earlier. In the court's mind, Ruth was manipulative. She tried to get the attention of Mohammed, and in the process, she tired him to the point of giving her notice that he was going to call off their relationship. Now, of course, Ruth's explanation on all this was provocation. She alleged that she had seen a document on AIDS control on the morning of the incident. She claimed that Mohammed tore the document when she threatened to expose him to his family. Now, the police officer who recovered exhibits at the scene never came across any torn documents. He was able to recover the love cards and even produce them in court as exhibits. The court said, "I find the accused allegation of the existence of an AIDS control document was an afterthought. Nowhere did the defense raise the issue of such a document with any witness, not even the investigating officers. I dismiss that allegation as an afterthought and also as a made-up story to escape the reality of what the accused had done. Even if such a document existed, which I find it did not, it could not justify the accused action on the material day." The next question, of course, is, was it self-defense? So what is self-defense? Section 17 of the Penal Code of Kenya defines self-defense and states this: subject to any express provision in this code or any other law in operation in Kenya, criminal responsibility for the use of force in the defense of person or property shall be determined according to the principles of English common law. The court cited a Court of Appeal case in Ahmed, Mohammed, Omar, and 5 others versus the Republic, which dealt with principles of English common law relating to self-defense. Now, in this case, what the court stated is that it is both good law and good sense that a man who is attacked may defend himself. It is both good law and common sense that he may do, but may only do what is reasonably necessary. But everything will depend upon the particular facts and circumstances. Some attacks may be serious and dangerous, others may not be. If there is some relatively minor attack, it would not be common sense to permit some act of retaliation which was wholly out of proportion to the necessities of the situation. If an attack is serious so that it puts someone in immediate peril, then immediate defensive action may be necessary. If the moment is one of crisis for someone in immediate danger, he may have to avert the danger by some instant reaction. If the attack is over and no sort of peril remains, then the use of force may be by way of revenge or punishment, or by way of paying off an old score, or may be pure aggression. There may no longer be any link with the necessity of defense. In the court's mind, the defense of self-defense either succeeds so as to result in an acquittal, or it is disproved, in which case, as a defense, it is rejected. In a homicide case, the circumstances may be such that it will become an issue as to whether there was provocation, so that the verdict might be one of manslaughter. So it's important to know that where you can actually show that there was that provocation, then the verdict goes to manslaughter and not murder. Now, the court also cited a Kenyan case in Jeru versus Republic, where the court held that the killing of a person can only be justified and excusable where the action of the accused which caused the death was in the course of averting a felonious attack, and no greater force than was necessary was applied for that purpose. For the plea to succeed, it must be shown by the accused on a balance of probabilities that he was in immediate danger or peril arising from a sudden and serious attack by his victim. it must also be shown that reasonable force was used to avert or forestall the attack. So basically, the principle in Kenya, as guided by English common law, is that the act of self-defense has to match the attack against you. If someone attacks you with a spoon and you attack them back in self-defense with a panga, then that cannot be held to be equal, all right? Now, based on these decisions, the court was well guided and stated that the court has to determine whether the attack on the accused by Mohammed was serious so that it put her in immediate peril in order to find that she was justified to take immediate defensive action. The court has to determine whether, at the time of the stabbing, the attack caused a crisis, putting her in immediate danger in order to justify instant reaction to avert that danger. For the plea of self-defense to succeed, it must be shown by the accused person that she was in immediate danger or peril arising from a sudden and serious attack. Now, the case law is clear that force which is reasonable to ward off an attack is the one acceptable as self-defense. As to whether Ruth Kamande was in imminent danger when she stabbed Mohammed, the evidence of the landlord and landlady that the accused and the deceased were on their feet at the time of attack, they testified that Ruth was the one in control. She had the knife in her hand. She used it over a period of time, a stab at a time, until the deceased was no more. That evidence clearly negated any allegation that she was warding off an attack on her by Mohammed. Now, what about the number of times he was stabbed? The court was of the view that the number of times the deceased was stabbed is also an indication whether the action was in self-defense. In this case, Mohammed had 25 stab wounds all over his body. The court was of the view that one can accept 1 or 2 stabs as inflicted in self-defense, even if the first stab was in self-defense to ward off an imminent attack. 25 stabs cannot be accepted as an act in self-defense, as it clearly rules out the fact that the various stabs were inflicted with the aim of warding off an attack. The court asked the question, were 25 stabs reasonably necessary to ward off an attack? Was that reasonable force used? It stated that I find that the force used by the accused on the deceased was not reasonably necessary, neither was it reasonable force. Now, the defense of Ruth Kamande was that there was a confrontation between her and Mohammed. Was there a fight between them? The court found that the injuries on Ruth Kamande were superficial cuts that were classified as harm by the doctor. The admission of Ruth Kamande in Kenyatta was for investigation of her complaint that she had been assaulted and sexually assaulted. Dr. Moya, who had treated her at Kenyatta, said that they carried out X-ray and abdominal scans to find out the level of injuries on the accused at all. It was their evidence that she had no fractures and no internal injuries. There was no stab injury on her at all. She had no injury that could be comparable to the ones suffered by the deceased person. The court was of the view that it can clearly not be said that the two were in a confrontation as the accused person claimed. Now, on the matter of admission to Kenyatta Hospital, the court was of the view that Ruth Kamande had fooled everyone to believe that she was a victim. This is what the judge says. I could see the embarrassment on the face of Dr. Moya, who was at pains to explain the necessity of admitting Ruth Kamande in Kenyatta Hospital and the need to carry out X-ray and scan examination. The doctors can be forgiven as they had an obligation to treat the patient taken to them. However, the patient had superficial injuries, was in no danger at all, and definitely, apart from ruling out any serious injuries on her, keeping her in hospital was superfluous. Now, the court also had to deal with the question of the experts, because part of what Ruth Kamande's lawyers did is that they discounted the expert testimony. The court said that in its duty to consider the evidence of the experts, including medical experts and other available evidence, the court has the right to decide to believe or disbelieve the evidence of an expert. However, where such evidence is not believed, the court must give reasons for so doing. A challenge to a medical opinion should be based on cogent proof. It is of course reasonable to say that in the case where the medical opinion is sought by a party to be challenged, that should be done by equally qualified medical personnel in the field in issue. The court will then have to determine which opinion to believe, weighing the opinions against the rest of the evidence adduced. So what the court is saying here is that if you want to challenge expert testimony, then you have to bring in an expert yourself. So in this case, Ruth Kamande and her team and her legal team needed to introduce a doctor who would have come and given a different statement touching on the same facts and based on the examination that they had done. In this case, the challenge to the pathologist's evidence and opinion was made in the final submissions by the lawyers. No challenge was posed in the cross-examination of the doctor. That challenge does not help at all, as it shows that it was an afterthought. The court is, however, enjoined to consider the expert evidence of the pathologist. Now, one of the issues that Ruth's lawyers said is that the injuries could not be ascertained because Mohamed had not been opened up, all right? Now, when the question was put forward to Dr. Odur, he stated that he examined his body and was able to form an opinion as to the cause of death because the body was still warm. Mohamed had been murdered the same day of examination. And on why they did not open up the body, they stated that it was because of Mohamed's family's religion. He, however, clearly stated that he was able to determine the cause of death even from the non-invasive examination he conducted on his body. The court considered this evidence and also the other evidence available. It was clear that he had been stabbed 25 times in sensitive areas of the body. The scene of the incident was, according to the eyewitnesses, full of blood. That was in consonance with the doctor's finding that he died of blood loss due to penetrating force trauma. That finding was in tandem with the evidence of the landlord and his wife, what they saw and what they heard, and of the police officers who visited the scene after the incident. Now, the court was of the view as well that there are some instances where the court may not even have the benefit of any medical evidence as to the cause of death. The court would still be expected to make a finding as to what may have caused the deceased's death. This is in instances where the deceased person is injured in the bush, and in the opinion of those with him, he is considered dead. Then they may leave the body there to call the authorities, only to find pieces of flesh and pieces of deceased clothing. Even in such circumstances, the court will be expected to draw conclusions as to the cause of death. In this case, however, the court was of the view that there was eyewitness account and there was a pathologist's opinion. And having considered both, the court had no doubt in its mind that the prosecution had established beyond any doubt that Mohamed died of stab wounds. The doctor's evidence had no reproach. It was unchallenged and was credible, logical, and reasonable. Now, of course, having considered all this, the court then has to make its decision. And this was the decision of the court, and I read it verbatim. Justice Jessie Lesiit said this: "Having considered the evidence adduced in this case, I am satisfied that the prosecution has proved beyond any reasonable doubt that the accused stabbed the deceased, inflicting fatal wounds on his body, which resulted in his death. I find that the prosecution has proved that the accused had formed the necessary malice to cause the deceased's death. In the circumstances, I find that the accused defense of provocation and or self-defense does not apply to this case. Both defenses are not available to the accused person. I'm satisfied that the charge of murder, contrary to Section 203 of the Penal Code, has been proved against the accused beyond any reasonable doubt. I reject the accused defense and find the accused guilty of murder, contrary to Section 203 of the Penal Code as charged. Consequently, I convict the accused of murder as charged under Section 322 of the Criminal Procedure Code." This judgment was delivered on the 31st day of May 2018, and Ruth Kamande was handed a life sentence for the offense of murder. This is part one of Ruth Kamande's case. In part two, we talk about her Court of Appeal case and what the argument was before the Court of Appeal and the decision of that court. This is V for Verdict.